Hey historians, this is your virtual video for Tuesday, and what am I holding? Can you see what I'm holding in my hands? So you probably know what this is. It's a little oversized, okay? It's not a real one. It is a $10 bill. And I'm wondering if you know who this guy is. Who is the man on the $10 bill? Maybe you know that the man on the $10 bill is Alexander Hamilton. So we're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton today, the kind of amazing human being that he was, flawed though he was. He actually changed America in a couple of seriously important ways. So we're going to start just talking about his life story and where he went and how he affected American history. So Alexander Hamilton was born in the Western Caribbean. This is Florida right here. If you look at my little map, this is Cuba. This is the island of Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And then we have these what are called the West Indies. And this little red one right here is an island called Nevis. It's part of an island pair, St. Kitts and Nevis. And Nevis is where Alexander Hamilton was born. Completely obscure life. It should have been nothing. I mean, nobody should have even cared about Alexander Hamilton. But of course, he made his reputation in the Revolutionary War. If you watched the Yorktown video, you heard how he had a great victory at Yorktown, and that led to Cornwallis's surrender eventually. And he was also one of America's most influential founding fathers. He was a champion of a strong federal government. Remember, federal government means like a national government or a central government where there's a federal government over the states. The states all have their own governments and their own laws, but they all agree together to go along with the federal government. Our federal government is in Washington, right? It consists of the legislative branch, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, and the executive branch, which is of course the president there at the White House. And so he also played a key role, not in the writing of our Constitution, but in the defending and the final ratification or passage of our Constitution. He was also the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, thus the money, right? And the fact that he's the only person on, I'm pretty sure this is true, that he's the only man, because the only person man on money, on currency, U.S. currency, who is not a president. Okay, he couldn't be the president, as we've talked about in the past, that you have to be born in the United States of America or on American territory to be the president, and he was born in the Caribbean, so he could not be the president ever. He basically, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, created the Treasury Department, and he built the financial foundation for the new nation. He had strong opposition from his rival, Thomas Jefferson. They had completely different visions for what America should be. Thomas Jefferson saw America the way, how he lived his life, right, on his plantation on this beautiful hill in the Piedmont part of Virginia, and lots of land and agriculture and country life. He thought that's how America would be. He didn't like the idea of America being industrial with cities and being, like New York or Philadelphia or Boston. But of course, Jefferson was completely wrong on that. We quickly became a manufacturing nation and lots of great cities. At that time, there was Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Savannah and Charleston. There weren't that many big cities yet, but of course now we have lots of them and small cities. And so Hamilton was right. Hamilton had the true vision, but he was also very outspoken. He was kind of polarizing. People were either on his side or not on his side, and so that kind of limited some of his career prospects. And then his life was cut short when he foolishly went to a duel with a man named Aaron Burr in 1804 and died. We can talk more about the actual duel in class, but I want to just move on to Hamilton and his life. So like I said, born in the Caribbean, either 1755 or 1757. The records aren't perfect. Back way then in the Caribbean, on the island of Nevis, his father was a Scottish trader named James Hamilton, and his mother's name was Rachel Fawcett Lavienne. Unfortunately, when Alexander was born, they were not married to each other because Rachel had been previously married and never been able to get a divorce from her first husband, actually her only husband, because she tried to divorce him. She left him because he was abusive, and he abandoned her and took all of her inheritance and spent all of her inheritance. And so she left him, and he actually had her arrested on charges of adultery and had her put in prison in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, the prison where she was kept was basically a walled fortress, just a wall. That's all it was, with just open ground in the middle, no roof. And she was locked up there for a number of months. And she couldn't do anything. She had no recourse. She had no representation. She had no money. And so she was done with that husband, obviously. And so when she met James Hamilton and she fell in love with him, they moved in together. And so when Alexander was born, he is what you call an illegitimate child when your parents aren't married, or you sometimes hear the word bastard, especially in the older documents. And bastard basically means your parents weren't married. We use it now sometimes as an insult, but legally it just meant then you weren't the child of parents who were married to each other. And so unfortunately for Alexander and Rachel, James abandoned the family in 1766, and then his mother got really sick and died. Alexander almost died, but he survived. And his mother died, and he was now kind of on his own. But people on Nevis already knew. Actually, I believe they'd moved to the island of St. Kitts by this time. They knew his reputation because he had already been working part-time to help his mother in this trading house where they traded sugar, and slaves. And he was 11 years old when they gave him a full-time position working in the trading house. And then a horrible, devastating hurricane hit the island in 1772. And Alexander wrote this amazingly eloquent letter describing the horror of the hurricane, of himself believing he was going to die, of the devastation on the island afterwards. And it was published in the newspaper in the Caribbean, but then it also was published in the newspaper in the United States. And so he developed this reputation, and locals and others decided to raise enough funds to send him to America to study. And so at the end of 1772, he arrives in New York, just as the colonies were gearing up for the American Revolution. And so he studies at King's College in New York City, which is now called Columbia University. And he gets involved in the colonial cause, writing pamphlets in support of the independence of the country. Sorry, I gotta fix my papers. I hate that, but what are you gonna do? There we go. He defended the First Continental Congress's proposal to embargo trade with Great Britain, basically to say, no, we're not gonna import or export anything with the British. And when the war began, he was commissioned into the army, and he basically became, at that point, General George Washington's right-hand man, his scribe, meaning he wrote all of his letters, all of his reports. They were dictated to him, or then he would write them in his own way. And so he was on General Washington's staff throughout the war, but Washington did not want to risk him in battle. And so it wasn't actually until the very, very end at Yorktown that Washington finally said, okay, you can lead this charge on this redoubt, which eventually led to the surrender of Cornwallis. And so his writing abilities and his military skills led him to thrive and built a reputation for him in the Revolutionary era society. One of the reasons he really wanted to fight in battle was it was a great way for someone with not much background, which of course Alexander had almost no background, family background, nothing prestigious in his background. It would build his reputation to have participated in the war and done well, which he did. And so in 1780, he married Elizabeth Schuyler, who was the daughter of General Schuyler, a wealthy New York landowner and general. They would have 8 children, and she was the love of his life and the source of stability for him through all the kind of crazy, tumultuous years that would come. And next page. In Hamilton's day, like I said, he had this reputation now of showing courage on the battlefield. Everybody knew about his brilliance in writing, that he was a genius. And so after the war, he was studying law. He passed the New York bar. That's how you become an attorney, a lawyer. And he became a lawyer in New York City. And in 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia, he attended. He was chosen as one of the 3 delegates from New York. Remember, they're having the Constitutional Convention because they need to overhaul the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation are what held the colonies together during the war. But one of the important things missing from the Articles of Confederation are a way to collect taxes. A government has a hard time functioning if it doesn't have any money or any income. And so that's why governments collect taxes, so that they can keep running. And so they needed new documents. And also there was no way to figure out what are we going to do when, there's something going on between 2 different states. How are we going to handle that? Who's going to make these decisions? And so Hamilton was chosen as a delegate to help create a new constitution for these new United States of America. Like I said, it was held in Philadelphia. Hamilton was known for having made a 6-hour speech about his own plan for this centralized government that would be over all the states. And some of the other delegates criticized him, saying he's trying to create a monarchy, he wants to make the president like a king, which of course was really not the goal. For Hamilton, it was to have this idea of a federal government that could be, kind of like the principal over all the teachers in a school, right? Something like that, or the head of a factory over all the supervisors in a place like that. So that was the idea behind this federal government. Now, Hamilton didn't really end up having much influence in the actual writing of the Constitution itself. His influence came afterwards, when they were trying to ratify it. Ratifying means passing it, getting it so that all the states will agree that we will abide by this Constitution. Some people were very opposed to the idea of a central government, of a federal government. They're like, we want to be independent. We want to be able to do what we do on our own. We don't want to have to say to the head government, the federal government, what we can do or not do. But to avoid chaos, to have an even taxation situation, to have a way to control commerce between the states, interstate commerce, a constitution overall was needed. And so Hamilton went to work after the Constitution was approved in the Constitutional Convention to help with its ratification. And what he did, along with James Madison and another famous founder, John Jay, they got together and started writing these. They were written like letters, but they were newspaper articles that were published all over the country in newspapers. And they were called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a very important group of documents. You will actually probably have to learn about at least 1 or 2 of them in your homework. We shall see. And basically the idea was to convince people these are the reasons a central constitution and a central government is important these are why our country needs these things to run smoothly. So they write these letters. They wrote them anonymously under a pen name, and they published a series of 85 essays or letters defending this new Constitution to the American people. Hamilton wrote at least 51 of them, and they are certainly his best known writings of all time. And of course, the Constitution was passed, and our Constitution has kept our country in existence for well over 200 years, by far the longest governing document of any country in the world. And so, very, very well done document. And we'll talk more about the Constitutional Convention next week. I just wanted to really kind of focus on Alexander Hamilton this week because he's just not that well known, or he wasn't that well known until he became the star of a Broadway musical. And all the people who had no idea who Alexander Hamilton was, now they can sing the song about him, right? Or they could say the rap about him since it's a hip-hop musical. So back to Alexander Hamilton that people didn't know until the past few years. Hamilton left the Treasury in 1795 and went back to practicing law. But when Washington stepped down from being president after 2 terms, which was, Washington set that precedent, that example, that model that an American president doesn't serve for his whole life. He is not a monarch. He is not a king. He serves a period of time and then he steps down. Now, Washington believed that, certainly, but Washington was also ready to go home. He was ready to retire, go home to Mount Vernon and be in his beautiful place on the Potomac River with his wife, whom he loved, and go back to private life. So he stepped down after having really kind of had to be convinced to even become the president. So he called on Hamilton when he was leaving his post as president and said, "Will you write my farewell address, or at least the majority of my farewell address?" And part of that Hamilton wrote for Washington to speak warned about the two important dangers. One of them, excessive political partisanship, meaning being excessively devoted to your political party, making political parties too important. I want you to just kind of think about current events and what's happening in our country right now, and partisanship and parties. And if you think Alexander Hamilton was right, that was dangerous for the country. So just think about that. And from that point, Hamilton continued to have influence behind the scenes, especially in the administration of John Adams after Washington. But the disagreements between them would divide the Federalist parties. The fact that Adams and Hamilton had these disagreements divide the Federalist Party into 2. So in 1800, that actually guarantees Thomas Jefferson the victory in the election of 1800. And so that's it for right now about Alexander Hamilton. So I'm also going to attach your homework to the email that this video comes in. And I may or may not see you Thursday. Probably will, undoubtedly with masks on. So we can be safe. But that's it for Tuesday, and I'll talk to you later. Bye for now.